Yeah, but they want us to be there. Can we talk?
All right. Well, welcome back, everyone, from the break.
They want us to be there. The microphone works if you want to just sit here. Maybe
In case you don't know me, I'm Derek Turner, Associate Professor of Philosophy, and it falls to me to introduce the Peru team. It's a privilege to be able to do that. The official title of our panel discussion, our second panel discussion, is Environmental Justice, Indigenous Peoples and Urban Marginals in Peru. And the members of our Peru team, in order, are Leo Garofalo, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Center for the Comparative Study of Race and Ethnicity. We have Maria Cruzaco, Professor of Economics, Joe Schroeder, Associate Professor of Neuroscience, Jenny Fredericks, Professor of Human Development and Director of the Holleran Center for Community Action and Public Policy, and Yibing Huang, Associate Professor of Chinese. Our first speaker will be Leo Garofalo, Associate Professor of History, who will lead things off. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Derek, for that introduction. And also, many thanks to everybody who's making this possible and the hard work that goes into it. In particular, the learning that we've had over the last 2 years, led by Professor Jane Dawson, has been inspirational, I think, for many of us. I've learned a tremendous amount from those seminars that she's run. Also, Diana Whitelow, the work that she's done to make it all happen and to be part of our seminar as well. That support from staff has been really wonderful. And also, my fellow center directors who have made this possible, particularly the Goodwin Hearing Center with Doug Thompson and that work. But also, we're very grateful to, in this particular group, to the activists, the scholars, the artists, the communities of Peru for the kind of teaching that they did with us and hosting us and taking care of us and feeding us and driving us around and so forth in Peru, so we could do the kind of learning that we have been undertaking, so we can bring it back and implement it in our courses. So we're very thankful to all of those groups for that support. And also, I think the inspirational support from development of Naima Gerby for her help in writing the initial grant, which got all of this started and sustained it over the last 2 years. And hopefully it'll continue for decades beyond in terms of the courses that we're offering to all of you. So thank you very much to all of those people that have made this possible. So it falls to me to help introduce Peru a little bit more to you and why we chose it as a site of social conflict over resources, and particularly those that are related to the environment, and the impact that the mining extraction and logging and also social conflict itself in putting people into movement, making people move into neighborhoods which could be unhealthy, as well as people dealing with the mining and extractive industries that they're in. So we're very interested in trying to give you a little bit of background on that. So that's my job here. Modern Latin America really is home today to a mining boom, which is based on the idea of resource extraction, the extraction of copper, of gold, of multi-metals, as well as oil, natural gas. And while these products are needed by the large economies, such as China in particular, this development and this kind of extraction is going to take place. This extraction also entails an exploitation of the environment. And Latin America is known today, of course, for the exploitation of the environment, the environmental problems that you've been hearing about over the last couple of days. All are typical of patterns that you see in Latin America. Latin America is also known for a history of colonialization, right, of colonization, right? A colonization that designated over hundreds of years, right, with the arrival of the Spanish and the Portuguese, but other colonial powers as well, the exploitation of gold and silver deposits in particular is a high priority, and using the coarse labor of indigenous peoples to make that possible, right? So some of the conflicts we're talking about today, as the speaker that preceded me pointed out, go back to the colonial period, right? People in Latin America understand them in a historical context, which is much longer, right? Struggles over resources, who benefits and who pays the prices for those profits. That didn't end with the end of the colonial period, with the end of Spanish Spanish domination in the areas that we think of as Spanish America, right? These parts here that were once part of the Spanish colony. As they freed themselves from Spanish rule in the beginning of the 19th century, colonialism may have ended, but the boom and bust cycle of mining exploitation and of exploiting other natural resources and using labor, and oftentimes coerced labor, indigenous labor, African descent labor, mixed race, mestizo, right, labor in these regions didn't go away, in what we call neocolonialism, right? A similar sort of arrangement that was meant to extract resources and profits from these regions, mainly for, in the 19th century, the profit of England, right, repatriating those profits to English banks, mining companies, investment consortiums, and so forth, and of course to the United States as well. And today we see a much broader group of interest exploiting these resources and investing in them. We see investment obviously continuing from the United States, Newmont mining that was referred to earlier being a good example of that. But we also have investments, direct investments, and some of the people in our Peru group will talk about this, of Chinese interests in Chinese mining companies, as well as Canadian companies, Australian companies, consortiums which involve companies from different places. Swiss companies are involved in Tintaya, one of the mines that we visited. There's Swiss interest in that in the southern part of Peru, but also inter-American consortiums, right? Capital coming from Brazil, capital coming from Chile, capital coming from Mexico, or consortiums which involve capital coming from different places, or companies that come from different places, exploiting the resources, the mineral resources and deposits of the Andes. So neocolonialism continues to be a problem, not only in the impact on where the profits go and where the price is paid, right, for that, but also in the continued exploitation of labor and the communities in those areas as well, right? One of the things that we notice about mining is that mining tends to, whether it's in the colonial period or the neo-colonial period, whether it's in the 16th century or it's in the 21st century, it tends to increase social inequality. So one of the things that we studied in our group was how Peru in particular suffered from this kind of inequality, and how this inequality gave rise to people's motivation to struggle for more say in how those resources were distributed, whether those resources were exploited in a particular way. But they also challenged systems of marginalization and exclusion of large portions of the population in Peru, right? Another historical trend, right? Many people who are citizens required to vote, but very few people who have really an opportunity to control the decisions of the government that they're supposed to be able to select. So when we think about Peru, we need to think something about its regions and its geography to understand both the resources that are there, but also the marginalization of the population and the control of the population. Peru is divided into 3 regions, right? You have a sense here that it's a mountainous region, right? You have places which are over 4,000 meters above sea level, right? It's about 13,124 feet above sea level. You have very high mountainous regions, right? The spine of the Andes runs here very close to the Pacific Ocean, right? So in Peru you have 3 regions. You have the coastal region, a thin strip here, sometimes only about 30, 40, 50 miles wide, right? Semi-desert, right? Most of it's very dry, depends upon irrigation, fed by rainfall and mountain glaciers up in the mountain region. Has a broad sort of mountain region here, the spine of the Andes, and then it has a large Amazonian region, a high and low jungle region, right? Amazonian jungle regions here. The majority of the population today is concentrated on the big cities in the coast, right? And that happens from the 1940s going forward. There's an out-migration from the Andes, right? From the agricultural regions in the highlands, and some out-migration from people living in the Amazon areas seeking better opportunities and such in the cities along the coast there. When that happens, many marginal neighborhoods and so forth are developed. So these cities have then many populations which have been displaced for economic reasons, and then in the 1980s and 1990s for political violence, which is concentrated in the jungle regions and in the highland regions, pushing people out into these cities. So some of the cases we look at study those marginalized urban sectors, right? The last thing that I would say briefly here is that we went to specific sites to get a sense for what some of the environmental justice issues were. here. We looked at the what are called the pueblos jóvenes, right? Sometimes they're not so young towns anymore. They've been around for many decades in some cases. But in the Lima area, so that's one of our cases of study. Another one is following the central highway and train line up to La Roya, where we studied mining and displacement of communities because of mining. We also looked at mining communities in the southern part of the Cuzco province, famous for Machu Picchu, right? In this area, Espinar, Tintaya, some of the mines there. And we looked at the experiences and heard about the experiences of people living in shanty towns in Lima who had been displaced from the central jungle region, Shipibo people who had been displaced from these areas because of political violence and also illegal mining and logging happening there. So basically, we're trying to introduce you to the idea of Peru and understanding some of its cases and some of the exploitation of resources there. This is just to give you a cross-section to understand it. It's a vertical world, right? It's a mountainous region. The coastal areas are like this. This is a cross-section from Chile, but it gives you a sense, right? Lima and the coastal towns we're looking at are here. The mining centers we're looking at La Roya, in Tintaya, up in the highland areas like this. Cusco is an intermontane valley kind of area, and then people who have been displaced from the jungle regions are coming from those areas. And this is just the one for the Cuzco region. One of the communities you'll learn about is a highland community of campesinos, peasant farmers, who are dealing with climate change. And they're basically up in a region like this, on the side of a mountain, from about 3,000 to about 6,000 feet above, or meters above sea level, living in this area here of the Cauca Valley, of the Vilcanota Valley. Okay, so that's it for my little introduction. Maria Cusco will continue, tell you a little bit about the economic aspect of what we're talking about.
Thank you, Leo, and I'd like to echo the words of thanks that Leo expressed at the beginning of his presentation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly review some of the key aspects of the Peruvian economy, and will then allow my colleagues at the table to present their views on the very specific site visits that we did and to relate them to why Peru is a case for this project. So it's been clear then that Peru has followed into its history of of orienting its growth through mining. The economy of Peru houses approximately 30 million people, and which, as Leo was indicating, are concentrated for the most part in urban cities. Lima, for example, the capital city, houses 8 million, between 8 and 10 million of the population. With a GDP of a little bit more than $300 billion, the economy of Peru is within it's like in the top 40 in the world. It's a top producer of silver, zinc, lead, and copper. And Peru is also a major producer of gold, although it didn't make it to the top 5. And as you know, the production of these metals, and like ferrous and non-ferrous metals, is extremely has extremely dangers on the environment, and it degrades the environment. It is also an activity, mining, that uses water, a lot of water, and water is a scarce resource in Peru. And not only is water scarce, but the agricultural land is also scarce. And so the combination, there is a trade-off between mining activity and agricultural activity, because it's taking away and polluting the water, and it's also degrading the soil in the valleys that are adjacent to the mountains where most of the mining is located. Very briefly, there are approximately 200 mining projects that are active in the country, and as I said, most of them are located in the Andes, and there are dozens of them, like over 100 that have been already abandoned. But these are only what we call the formal or legal projects. Informal mining is rampant, and it takes place particularly in the eastern, southeast part of Peru, and where mercury is basically thrown into water streams in order to identify gold. Although mining is such an important activity for this country, as a percent of GDP, which captures the value of what's produced, it's only representing 10%. And yet, this activity, it's generating more than 50% of total exports and more than 40% of the government revenue through income taxes, corporate income taxes. The country has been growing as it has become extremely open to foreign direct investment and led by the impetus of China that demands lots of the minerals that we produce. In South America, there's only 4 or 5 countries, including Peru, Chile, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, that have a surplus, and it's trading with China. Because China relies so heavily on the import of certain commodities produced here. Peru is considered to be a middle-income country, and its average per capita income is $10K. Also, I like to point out that Daniel, the previous presenter, was explaining to us how, sort of like center-left presidents, when they come into power, they abandon their progressive discourse and begin to behave in a more corporate fashion. And the reason is that when they realize that their revenues and their ability to implement projects is so much dependent by mining, then they feel trapped in between the struggles of local communities and indigenous populations and the demands and how they are courted by corporations who are interested in exploring and exploiting their resources in the soil. At the moment, the amount of foreign direct investment that's been identified for Peru in the next 5 years is truly in the billions. And one project in particular that Daniel, I think, referred to is a project in Cajamarca that's been placed in the back burner. It's a project to produce gold, a combination of Newton and Yanacosha's interests. And it has been paralyzed due to the activism and the very well-founded claims of local communities on the use of water and what's going to happen to water. Because Cajamarca, by the way, is a location that has enormous potential for agricultural activities and cattle raising. I know that I have a strict limit with time, so I'm going to race a little bit through my notes here. Again, mining, although generating so much revenue for an exchange from exporting activities and having been a resource for governments to implement poverty eradication projects, only employs between 2% and 3% of the labor force. And the people that work in the mining sector are very well paid vis-a-vis other workers. So these are individuals who earn more salaries per year. In Peru, you earn 14. If you work in the formal sector, you earn 14 salaries a year because you get 2 bonuses in July and in December. And workers in the mining sector get between 16 and 17, and in addition, they get dividend distributions or profit distributions. And in Lima and in other urban centers, there's been a dramatic increase in the price of real estate. And that is one of the reasons is that people who work for the mining sector purchase real estate, and that's generated something. Some people say it's a bubble. Some other people think that it's not. An important institutional characteristic in Peru is that 50% of the corporate income tax that mining companies pay reverts back to localities. However, localities oftentimes don't have the capabilities to use those monies. In addition, as my colleagues are going to point out later, the canon can only be used for investment projects. It cannot be used to pay salaries. And there is a very lengthy bureaucratic process that communities have to go through in order to have a project approved. So what you see is that mayors will, for example, beautify their plazas and invest their monies in ways that are non-productive at all. But in the process, what they do is they're generating income for people who are going to be hired to do the construction process. Also, I have an example of a very small district in Apurímac that has currently an income level of 40 million, and in the next 2 years, due to the presence of a Chinese mining project, the canon going to Apurímac is going to increase to $1 billion. And this is a settlement or a district that doesn't even have that many community presence of many people, and so the question is what they're going to do with all that money. So in terms of mining and its social impact, I think that others before me have stressed the tensions that exists between communities, indigenous people, NGOs who work with them in civil society, government officials, and international corporations. Clearly, we are witnessing enormous deforestation, pollution, and the poisoning of children through lead. So to sum up my thoughts here, one of the thoughts that somehow we all converge in our team is that one cannot look at environmental justice without looking at social justice. And so in this country, the mining history is ridden with conflict. And also it shows that the country has had a structural inability to break away from an insertion in the global economy where it specializes in the production of commodities. Despite the fact that its services has grown, it hasn't been capable of moving up the value ladder. The Shining Path activities, this is a political subversive movement that was initiated in the late 70s and truly flourished in the 80s and 90s. And this terrorist movement represents a hiatus in Peru's history, socially, economically, and culturally. It brought the country to its knees in the 80s and early 90s, and it manifests in the displacement of people from the countryside, rural areas, to Lima and other urban centers on the coast. And these individuals, now they are living now together with those who are displaced by mining activities. So there's a lot of displacement and a lot of marginality in urban settlements. And I believe my colleague, Ibing, will, in his remarks, he will refer to the issues of identity and conflict and intergenerational conflict that arises from that subversive movement and in their quest to bring more social justice to the country, the Shining Path. The country and civil society, as well as politicians, are slowly responding to the issues that we have laid out. And one of the questions that we would like to entertain for later is there hope? And what are the opportunities ahead? So Joe is going to follow up.
Thank you. As a neuroscientist, one of my areas of interest and research is in neurodegeneration and neurotoxicity. And recently I've been focusing on the effects of heavy metals on not only at a neural level but at a behavioral level. So my students and I work in the lab with animal models of lead exposure, and we then see how that affects the brain and see how that affects animals' learning behavior. So I was interested in joining the Peru group and sort of integrating what we've learned in the lab with and applying that to a real-world hands-on experience of how lead affects or how heavy metals affect individuals and communities, and sort of looking at how Peru is balancing this rapidly growing economy and extraction of natural resources with the contamination issues that come with that, and how that primarily affects marginalized populations. So I am tasked with giving you an overview of some of the places that we visited and to explain very quickly why we visited each of those places. The first and second day that we were in Peru, we visited a community that is in the city of Lima. That's called Canto de Gallo. That means, the English translation of that means call of the cock. And the community is a Shipibo community, which the Shipibo are an indigenous people from Peru that their homeland is in the Amazon highlands, the Amazon highland basin, in the eastern part of the country. And as Maria highlighted, part of or as a result of the shining path political violence of the 80s and 90s, the Shipibo people were a target of this terroristic activity, and were forced to move from their community, which looks like this, their homeland, and literally walk for several weeks over several hundred miles through the Andes region to the coast in Lima, just so that they could ensure their own protection from this violence. And this is where they ended up. When they arrived in Lima, they basically, the only place they could find where they could keep themselves as a cohesive community was to settle on this landfill. It's basically a garbage pile of household waste that is covered with a thin layer of dirt. And they settled there, and over the past several decades have been building this community, building their houses out of whatever they could find. And I was especially struck by the cohesiveness of their community, which is primarily, from my standpoint, maintained by the matriarchs of the community. They're incredibly democratic and sort of take on the issues of their community among themselves and are not reliant on outside help from the city of Lima or government officials. And so we went there to see to hear their story and to see what they are facing, and they're currently facing a very dramatic issue, which I'll highlight in a second, about the future of their community. On the right, you have an overview, an aerial shot of their community. So that highlighted region is basically the area of this landfill that they're living on. And you can see some of the houses that they've made. And then in this lower part, this is the Rimac River, which flows through Lima and is the source of a lot of contamination. Here's another view of the Rimac River and the city of Lima, which, as Maria highlighted and Leo, is very arid. It's extremely crowded, and it doesn't get a lot of rainfall, so everything is dusty, dry, and dirty. This is another view of the Rio Rimac, and over here is the edge of the Canto de Gallo community. And one of the issues that they're facing, actually, before I get to that, I'll show you some photos of some of the community members. The man up here on the right is basically the head of what's the equivalent of, say, the PTA, and parents of the children in this community have taken it upon themselves to construct their own schools, one school, and to hire their own teachers and come up with their own curriculum that they have done pretty much without the help of the city officials, because they're not really even recognized as an official community by the city of Lima. So they've done all this by themselves. So he was telling us about some of their struggles in maintaining this school for the education of their youth. One of the issues that they're facing, which is very current, is this. Actually, go back to this slide. There's a highway project that is going to basically come right through here along the river. It's a city development project that will basically bulldoze this community that these people have established for the last decade and a half or so. So when we were there, the bulldozers were literally parked outside the community ready to go. And the community leaders have made an agreement with the mayor, who is currently in office, to move their community. And they've arranged for a plot of land which is pretty much right across the river from the landfill where they're located, to move their entire community across the river so that they can have a safe place to live with electricity, running water, and all the amenities that you'd expect in a vibrant community. So this is a shot that we took looking from Canto de Gallo. Here's the river right here, and then this is the area that they're considering developing. These are this is a shot of the photos of the plans that one of the local community leaders showed us that was given to them by the city, the initial plans of what their community would look like. So here's Canto de Gallo here. Their new community would be located in this area, and these are some of the dwellings that they have envisioned for the people. Not exactly the equivalent dwellings that they're used to in their homeland, but it's certainly a step up from what they're living in now. Here's another shot an image that I retrieved from the internet that shows basically the same thing. Here's the new community, the Rio Remac here, and Canto de Gallo is in this region right here. So while we were there, they were explaining to us that all of this was promised to them, but that it may never materialize because there is an effort afoot to throw the current mayor out of office. And if she leaves office, then whatever was promised to them is sort of up in smoke. And as I said, the bulldozers are right outside their community. So they had a referendum in early March, and thankfully, we've learned since we've returned that the mayor survived this referendum, and hopefully the promises that the city of Lima made to them will come to fruition. Okay, so that's one of the first places that we visited. And as Leo and Maria indicated with Leo's maps, most of the population of the country of Peru is located on the coastal regions. And Maria alerted me to this map that she thought I should include in my presentation, and it shows each of these little sort of clear dots is a region of mining activity. There are 312 of them active in the country of Peru today. And what this map shows are the 29 most densely populated areas that are surrounding those mining activities, and with respect to the lead-contaminated areas. And what it's highlighting is in this yellow and brown, and you can see in Lima right here, this sort of gray color. That is where most of the population of Peru is located. And what it's designed to indicate is that 2/3 of the Peruvian population live in one of these densely populated and severely contaminated environments. So I also put on here some of the other places that we visited. We started out in Lima, then we flew to Cuzco, which is in the province of Espinar, and then later traveled from Lima to La Arroya. And I'll briefly highlight some of the things that we saw there. So we flew to Cuzco, and then were driven to the Tintaya mine. Tintaya is one of the largest open-pit copper and gold mines in the world. It's actually two mines which are right next to each other. Tintaya is an older mine that has been exhausted and is currently being, the activity is moving literally next door to another mine called Antapaccay. So this is an overhead shot of it, and you can't really get a good perspective of it from this view, but it is literally miles across, and the open pit mines are several hundred meters deep. And of course, with this mining activity comes the displacement of some of the local population. And what we wanted to explore was how is the mine working with the local populations to compensate them or to work with them to allow this mining activity. One of the things that I was struck by as we visited, we were guests of the mine while we were there. So we stayed in their housing facility at the actual mine, and were driven everywhere by mining officials. And originally we wanted to be able to speak to some of the local people who have had a recent history of confrontation with the mining company. That, for a variety of reasons, never really materialized. So, granted, we had a sort of a one-way perspective of the mining activity in this region. That was the perspective of the mining company. Well, one thing that I saw, or I was particularly struck by, is here. This is a peasant farmer's farm, and he's a dairy farmer. And he was one of the few people that were refused to move from the mining area and be displaced to a neighboring community that the mine set up for them. And this farm is literally in the middle of this mining activity. So these giant dump trucks are driving down this road past his farm, and he has made arrangements with the mining company to be able to enter and leave his farm as he wishes to go to the local city or whatnot. Here is one of the rivers that flows past the mine, and some of the locals washing their clothes in the waters of it. And one of the things that we did after we visited the mining activity was we were escorted to these projects in the surrounding community that have been set up by the mining company. And they're using monies from their mining activity that is above and beyond what Maria described as the canon. It's this 50% tax on their proceeds from mining activity. The Extrata company, which runs the Tintaya and Antapaccay mine, has set up an additional funds to control these community development projects in the surrounding community that is outside of the bureaucracy of the canon. One of the things that they've done is to develop this educational center. It's basically a school that's set up for local teachers to come and learn pedagogical techniques and to coordinate their own teaching activities with some new ideas or modern techniques that that are used across the whole country. So not only do the teachers come here to be trained to be better teachers, but individuals, students from the local schools can come here for 2 weeks at a time to learn in these modern classrooms. Another of the activities that we saw was there's a dairy farm, or a dairy activity where the mine is working to breed cattle for dairy operations, which will produce more milk at this very high elevation. It's 14,000 feet up. And the problem with dairy farming at that elevation is that the cattle that are traditionally used for dairy farming can't produce the milk when they're at that elevation. And so they're working with a new breed of cattle that is a cross between cows that can live at this high elevation with cows that produce high quantities of milk. And the mine is then giving these cattle to the local farmers, and then the farmers bring their milk to this dairy operation, we toured this plant where they make milk, cheese, ice cream, and then sell it to the local community, and the proceeds come back to the farmers themselves. This is just a shot of the town of Yauri, the main street in Yauri, which is the closest town to the mine itself, and where all of these facilities are located. Here's a community playground that was set up by the mine. And again, this was done with funds from the mine that were above and beyond the canon tax that is imposed on all the mining companies that are active in Peru. So we came away from this with the impression that the larger mining companies, the more modern mining companies, are perhaps operating more responsibly, and what the main problem in terms of contamination issues in Peru comes from informal mining, where there is less control and less oversight of mining activities. The next place we visited was the Potato Park. The Potato Park is a collection of 5 communities that are perched atop a mountain in the Cuzco region of Peru, very high up, 14,000 feet elevation, and they are a collective of 5 communities that have, for generations, cultivated many different varieties of potatoes. So when you and I go to the grocery store, we might see 4 or 5 different varieties of potatoes, and they're all used for consumption, eating. But these people have developed literally thousands of different varieties of potatoes through their own crossbreeding techniques. So they have potatoes that will grow within a very limited elevation range. And some of these potatoes are not only used for food, but for medicines and other purposes. There's a picture in the middle. It's just some of the more colorful varieties of them. And these communities are largely, or probably entirely, self-sufficient. They don't rely on the outside communities for any of their basic needs. And they have worked with an NGO, the Andes organization, to establish a ecotourism, a form of ecotourism where you can go and stay with this community and observe their activities, learn how they are basically a microcosm or their own little laboratory of global warming. And what we've heard over and over again while we were visiting them is that they're perched on top of this mountain. And these varieties of potatoes, which can only be grown in a very limited range, are gradually being moved up and up and up the slopes of this mountain as they experience global warming. So while the effects of global warming from a worldwide perspective may not be all that evident with the potato park, they are seeing firsthand the effects of global warming as they have to move their fields from year to year further and further up the sides of this mountain until eventually they're going to run out of room. So we had the opportunity, Leo and Yibing and I, to stay with some of the local farmers. This is the farmer that we stayed with, and 3 of his, I think, 5 children. This is his house, which was one of the nicer houses in the community. It did not have running water. They had to move. This is a view from the room where we stayed, which is on the 2nd floor of this house, down to a stream which flowed through here, where they would retrieve water every day or several times a day and bring it to the kitchen where they cooked over an open flame. And the only modern amenity they had was electricity, which supplied a light bulb that hung from the ceiling in 2 or 3 rooms of this house. So they prepared dinner for us and breakfast the next day and gave us a bedroom on the 2nd floor. Again, the house didn't have any heat, so it was quite cold that night, and we had to march down this path. And this photo was taken from the outhouse of of the house where we were staying. And I was, at the end of this visit, was somewhat envious of their lifestyle. They they pretty much have it figured out. They have a good, very cohesive community that is very democratic, and they realize the pressures that the issues that they're facing from the world at large, and are trying to address them themselves. So in a way, I felt envious for them. I also felt somewhat guilty. You know, we came in with these big 3-liter bottles in plastic jugs for our water, instead of drinking the water from the stream. And Yabing was showing him his computer, and I was letting the kids play with my iPhone, and I felt like apologizing at the end, saying, I'm sorry that we sort of intruded on your lifestyle, which in the end I was kind of envious of. So let me just quickly move to the last place that we visited, which was La Arroya. La Arroya is, again, in the highlands, on the top of a mountain in the Andes that is about 6 hours east of Lima. So we drove there on a pretty precarious drive one day. I encountered a snowstorm in the middle of summer, which was in the southern hemisphere. And this is a photo of La Arroya on the top. La Arroya is one of the 7 most polluted cities in the world because of this lead smelting plant that has existed there for coming up on probably 100 years or so. And it has gone through several different ownerships over the course of this, of its existence, and has come under pressure from governmental and environmental groups to clean up their act. They have spewed this contamination into the air through the lead smelting activities, and literally some of the mountains, nothing grows on them. There's this sort of thin white film over everything. You can see it here. This is what all of the mountains or the hills surrounding the plant look like. That is downwind of it. If you're on the other side of the city, it's not as significant. There are some areas of green vegetation. But one of the things that I was struck by was the signs that we saw throughout the community. And I don't speak Spanish, so I have to try and remember what some of these say. But it says, the first one says Do Run, which is the company that currently runs the smelting operation, is the present and future of La Arroya. And the second one says La Arroyans want to work, and no liquidation. La Arroya will stand tall and work towards victory, or something like that? Okay.
You're good.
And the first one says no to the NGO anti-miners, anti-mining NGOs. Fuera?
Yeah, get out of La Arroya.
Get out of La Arroya. So we were struck by all of these signs that we saw everywhere, and it turns out that because of the pressure to clean up their act, one of the previous owners shut down the facility, and the people were left with no opportunity for employment. So given the choice of living in this extremely contaminated environment versus providing for their families, they chose providing for their families. So now they've sort of they're advocating for working with this new owner, even though they're living in this contaminated environment, because they need to provide for their families rather than be worried about environmental contamination. I think those are just some of the places that we visited, and Professor Fredericks will highlight some of the issues that are faced by the citizens of some of these areas.
Hi, I come at this, I'm a developmental psychologist and I'm interested in schools and reform. So we saw a lot of schools, we saw a lot of hospitals, so I come at it from that. Just one thing from Joe that struck me as the comment that exemplifies environmental justice. When we're in the peasant farm, the peasant farmers looked at us and said, "Why is your life ruining us?" And we didn't know what to say. So, they are really struggling with being scientists and figuring out how to live in this new reality. And, we haven't experienced the climate change they have yet, but they're really struggling, and we didn't know how to respond to that. Okay, I'm going to be very brief, but I just want to talk a little bit about some of the tensions and some of the developmental issues and the tensions between moving and staying that we saw. First, there's pretty good research suggesting that there's high levels of mercury poisoning both in women and children because of mining. It's affecting brain development, it's affecting a variety of learning outcomes. So we have that reality. Then we have the reality of the two Perus. We got to see both of those Perus. Outside, Lima is thriving. Yeah, well, parts of Lima are thriving, and we got to see the nice, the effects of capitalism and global development. And then we got to go to rural Peru and see the poverty. And 78% of children, indigenous children, are living in poverty. So we're really still talking about they have not really benefited from this economic growth. We also, we went to a lot of schools, and those were enlightening, and they often were the beacon of hope in these kind of really desperate communities. But there were several educational challenges. We went to some urban schools were in communities ravaged by violence and drugs. These were indigenous people who were moved, had just moved to the city, had no job opportunities, and kind of, I studied poverty in the United States, but this was a very different kind of poverty. We also went to rural areas where the teachers talked about child malnourishment as a major problem, and that kids just had attention and learning difficulties. So these kind of schools were like beacons of hopes, but they were really dealing with some challenges. Okay, these are just some of the schools we went to. That was a school in La Roya, I think this is from Old Maracocha. Is that from Old? Well, some kids.
Those kids are from that same school.
Oh, those kids are from that same school. And we asked the teachers what life was like, and that's okay. And I'll never forget one teacher said, I said, "What do you see as the future of this community?" A slow, painful death. So, we were there, and it was not a nice place to be, but yet, they were living there, and they were trying to make a life. Okay, there's L'Oreal, Joe showed some pictures, but it was just, you're driving along, and all of a sudden the mountains change, and it's white, and it was a very depressing place to be. But yet that was their life. Okay, so we really saw this tension between staying in their communities versus moving. Many of these mining companies offered to move, and I will talk about a case where they built a whole new town for a community, but many of them didn't want to go. So these were their jobs, these were their families, they had built lives, and we were surprised, or I was surprised by how much life was actually in these very depressing places. And how they still wanted, when they, Joe mentioned it, they still wanted the lead smelting plant open. Because in the end, jobs were more important than the environmental contaminants. So kind of balancing that tension. Okay, I want to just briefly talk about the cannon. Peru has built its economy on mining. And the assumption is, and it has really 40% of taxes, it's really funding a lot of things. And part of the mining deal is they have a cannon that they're supposed to give money back to communities. The idea is to kind of compensate communities for some of these environmental and social kind of contaminants. We saw the reality of how the cannon was actually being spent. Many communities we saw totally dilapidated buildings and a beautiful plaza. Well, I think we know what the cannon money was being used for. In very few cases did we see the cannon being used to really improve the situation of families and children, and I'll kind of describe some reasons why. This I think illustrates this tension. We went to a community where Old Maracocha and New Maracocha, the cannon money was being used to build these wonderful, beautiful government buildings, and people were living in these kind of conditions. So it was not going to really help these individuals live a better lifestyle, but it was making the mayor look very good. So this was off. We saw many examples of this. Was there? Oh, okay. First I'll talk about problems with well, no, maybe first I'll talk about this. We went to a community, Old Maracocha and New Maracocha. That was Old Maracocha. You saw the conditions of those buildings. The mining company had enough money to build a whole town for 5,000 people. That's staggering to me that they are able to do that, but they built schools, churches, museums, everything. This is the new town. Don't see too many people there. So they built this beautiful town, much better, plumbing, much higher quality of living for these families, but no one wanted to, or few people had moved in. Many people decided to still stay in their old communities. So was it they didn't trust the mining company? Was it they were comfortable? We couldn't really get a straight answer, but it was kind of a ghost town, this new kind of ghost town that was built, and then right next door was this totally dilapidated town where people were living. Okay, so why was the cannon not working, and maybe how could it work better? I mean, Maria talked about a few of these. It had to be used on infrastructure. So we saw examples, and they talked about examples of building schools, but they couldn't hire teachers. So that doesn't seem like a very good use. Now, they built roads, to help with the mining, but often not for communities. We talked to many of people at different levels. I mean, one of the great parts about this trip is we talked to, the people living in the communities. We talked to the officials making decisions, and often saw how they often had different interpretations of reality. But many people talked about the political corruption that really made this difficult for the cannon money to be spent. Public officials had to show they built something, so that was kind of, rather than kind of helping the communities. Some people talked about having to return funds because they didn't actually even know how to spend this fund. So all this money that's in Peru that could actually make a difference is not really making a difference. And then finally, it was very clear that the individuals most hurt by this, the indigenous people, were not involved in the discussions. We saw examples of officials building housing that did not meet cultural needs. No one was moving in. They were building single-family homes next to each other. That was not how the indigenous people had generally lived. So it was very clear. We talked to mining company officials, and we talked to people, and they were not involved at all in the discussions of how this money could be better used. So there was a lot of potential. With this tension, Peru has decided this is their economy, but how can this be their economy and also benefit women and children? We saw a few examples of that.
I think my colleagues have really done a terrific job, summarized our trips and the missions. And here, I, as a professor of Chinese literature and also a person from China, I want to give a bit my personal reflection on this trip. When Jennifer, he just talked about, he said, well, there are absolutely, at least there are two Perus. I say, well, not only two, but at least three or more. Three, you can say, geographically, Peru have three parts, right? The coast, the Andean mountain regions, and the Amazon rainforest regions. And talking about, we don't talk about, let's forget about race, other things. I think another issue, where's mine now?
Oh, I have another one. Oh, I have another slide.
Where's my slide? Oh, no.
Keep on
going.
I didn't realize.
All right. The other issue you can say, Peru, the contemporary Peru is facing, you can see also there's another way of seeing Peru, the three Perus, different levels, how do you articulate the statehood of Peru? And the other part is that, how many communities, the diversity of communities. And the third part for me is how do you articulate a new issue of new Peruvian citizenship, like namely who qualifies to call himself as a Peruvian citizenship. For instance, we during the trip we had this. I got this data said Peru, for instance, indigenous people in the 1980s, many of them they didn't have the ID card, the national ID card. So if you were looking like some person out of town, looking a bit suspicious, or looking a bit like the sympathizer of the Shining Path, you might be stopped by the police and ask you, what's your ID card? In that sense, the ID card represents fear and insecurity and exclusion. Well, today, the Peruvian, I think right now the government, you have the national ID card program, so now including all the displaced communities who now has been relocated in urban, although the urban margins of Lima, the ID card represents their new demand of right and citizenship and representation, political representation. Obviously, what I saw from my eyes is still it's an issue of Peru. What is facing is not just the environmental justice, issue, or, for instance, the debate on the role of mining in Peruvian, not just economy, but also I think has a lot to do with the Peruvian politics. We have, had many times of discussions with politicians, business people, indigenous community members, and social scientists and artists in Peru. I think one thing came out, again, many of them agree upon that the environmental justice fundamentally is an issue of social justice, and sometimes, it's also political justice and, historical justice. And to skip all those, I come to the day before the last day of our trip in Peru, and I followed Maria's suggestion. I visited the Peruvian National Museum. There they had this ongoing exhibitions called On the Shining Path. Many of you probably, know one way or the other, you've heard of the Shining Path, but you heard, here in this country, the Shining Path is designated, by the U.S. state and state government, and also the mainstream media as, what we call the terrorist groups. And but I was more interested in, surprised, but also interested knowing that how this part of Peruvian history, which was very recent, since the late 1970s, actually started exactly, however you can say, it's 1980, lasted till probably late 1990s, and how that has been represented in the National Museum. And I got this timeline. So the Shining Path started with 1980s when, as a matter of fact, that was the first time in many years that the end of the military dictatorship, they ended. Now they had the first time for for a election, a national election, and the Shining Path. Actually, Shining Path was not their name. It was named, came from their publication. They were considered a faction, one of many, the Peruvian Communist Party organizations. And the Shining Path, however, decided not to participate in this election, right? And instead, they took on armed, they would say fight, but we can say, they took the road of violence. But the violence is not only in the remote indigenous areas. As a matter of fact, it happened in the heart of Peru, or the downtown of Lima itself. That was 1980. If you could read it, yeah, I took it from my cell phone. It's December 26th. In the city, in the central part of Lima, there suddenly appear many dead dogs. But it's very interesting, surprising. I had this unlikely encounter with China. The dogs hanging there by the Shining Path member, there was a sign on it, it said, Deng Xiaoping, son of a bitch. This tremendously surprised me and interested me. What is the connection between the Shining Path in Peru and to something, or Deng Xiaoping? You know, how many of you, who's Deng Xiaoping? Deng Xiaoping was considered the leader, the permanent leader of China right after Mao, and he was also the major architect and design of the Chinese open door policy, who eventually turned China into open door policy, and that marked the beginning of the Chinese the fastest economic growth in the world since 1980. If you look closely, you can see this is it's a demonstration of violence. It's also a manifesto of the Shining Path. What interested me was the symbolism. And obviously, from my point of view, that shows the Peruvian, this number one is that the Peruvians' quest for modernity is pretty much, it's very much it's an ideological issue, and it's politically debated and divided. And has also something to do with what we call the global modernity, not just and as well as what we would call the Cold War legacy. But from this perspective, however, I saw that the current Peruvian history and the violence is very deeply ingrained with what we call the developmental capitalism, and also the what we today call the neoliberalism, and as well as its competing ideologies, the former what we say the communism or Maoism. But one way or the other, what we saw here is that the issue of many what we call the social injustice is closely associated with this political violence. And here there's another sign put here. It said a group of people displaced by the armed conflict and had been eventually remobilized to the outskirts of Lima. That's what we saw in the earlier the representations that the Shipibo people from the Amazon and many other indigenous people, they found themselves in the sort of the urban wasteland of Lima, the outskirts. As a matter of fact, it's the result of this internal war or conflict. And here, quickly, on the other hand, I found this representation of violence, political violence. Sometimes it's not only represented through the mainstream or what we call the national art form. Surprisingly, what we saw here is the indigenous artist, his representation through the traditional what we call el tablo, or nativity box. The representation they see here is the Shining Path members terrorizing, the local people. They were wearing the red hoods. Yet here is the other side, is the military wearing the black hood. They were equally, execute violence on the people, on the indigenous people. And what is I found most interesting and disturbing is the third one. is as a matter of fact, this showed the peasants, they also themselves took violence upon for instance, here was I think it's the journalist who interviewed, in that region, but, a number of the journalists were executed by the peasants. Of course, here, that's that period, however, the ending of the Shining Path, to a certain extent, was credit to the President Fujimori's rule. And ironically, himself today represents, the kind of the military dictatorship, even though he was democratically elected. So, what did I learn from here? What I learned is that we see I saw the Peruvian department of facing the development and also the preservation of indigenous identity and culture. Fundamentally, it's a local issue. It's it's an issue of state politics. It's it's an issue of participatory democracy and inclusive, policy making. But it's also closely tied to what we call the global modernity. But that issue has been unfolding, a journey long before 1990s or 1980s. In other words, I found, more and more, I personally felt I had to study more about Peru, not only its current history, but also, previously modern history, but probably even to its pre-Columbian history. To conclude I want to take a different approach. I remember when we discussed how to conclude, what should I do? And Professor Rice Gonzalez said, even you are besides being a professor, you're also a poet. Why don't you read a poem? and I said, well, this trip was so overwhelming, I didn't have enough time to sit down to write a poem. But when I went back to my notes, I found a short, one or two sentences when I was writing in the copper mining, the field, Tintaya, which was about 13,000 feet above the sea. That night we slept right in the mine, but not literally in the mine, but in the guest house. But that gave me a strange sense of a déjà vu and familiarity, because I myself I had been traveled to many parts of China, including Tibetan plateau, which was even higher than that. I slept on the places in the middle of nowhere, strange, deadly silence, quiet, on the altitude of almost 20,000 feet high. But nevertheless, that night I jot down some notes, and I'm going to read this in Chinese, and just to confuse you guys, huh? I will do a little translation. I just roughly did it, last night. I'll read the Chinese, so let you get a sense, a third perspective in this issue, add a sense of diversity to our Peru project. I was talking about the silence of that night on the high plateau in Tintaya. 我梦见很多我不认识，但与我相似的人，像铜一样被挖出，又重新被埋进去，埋进地球深处。So the English rough translation is, I dreamed of those whom I didn't know, but who looked just like me, dug out like copper, and buried again, back into the source of the earth. So in that poem, I use that poem to appreciate my appreciation, to show my appreciation to the group, and to show the Peruvian people that have been so generously received us as guests. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We do have some time for a few questions. I'll repeat questions back to make sure that everyone can hear. So I don't know if anyone has question. Yes, Jesse.
Professor Cuzco mentioned that there were 200 active mines and 100 plus retired mines, and that's kind of made me think that's got to be destroying the land and the livelihood of people that live so closely with it. So I was wondering what sort of reclamation efforts they have, and if those include indigenous peoples, perspectives, and ideas.
Okay, thanks. So the question is, what sorts of reclamation efforts might there be in place? And do those efforts involve local indigenous communities at all?
Jesse, I don't know if I'm gonna have a voice now, so I'm gonna try to talk. I know there's water here. There's more than 300 active mines. I have to correct myself. It was not even 200. It was more than 300, as Joe showed in his map of Peru later. No, people, because the question is, are people mobilizing in order to claim back those lands or close those activities, right? And I was talking with Daniel earlier, who represents the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and Indigenous People, and I wanted to know how many have initiated complaints to their institution. The government would not admit that those claims are legal or that they can proceed because that land belongs to private owners. And so, in a way, native populations have lost their property of communal lands. It is a very complex issue, and I would like for Leo to help me with this, because there's been in the past, maybe 80 years ago or so, there were different laws that would grant rights of use to peasant communities in the country. But this is to work on the land, but I have not heard of any of those rights granted to communities to produce in the mines. And so I would say that there is very little, but I would like, for you, Leo, to maybe develop on that idea on property rights of land among indigenous communities.
So, one, the state claims all, and this is true of, I think, all of the Latin American modern states today, claim mineral rights, right? So communities can have traditional claims and traditional use of lands and the resources on those lands, including the water, right? But that the mineral resources underneath them can be leased and controlled by the state, right? For national development, for geopolitical concerns, right? If they have strategic resources there they need for border conflicts with other countries and so forth. So that's been something that has obviously created tension, right? Because if you're farming on top of the land, as Joe was showing us, and somebody wants to take the copper out from underneath it, if it's an open pit mine in particular, it's simply not going to be able to coexist. The collective claims on land in Peru have been recognized by different governments, but it takes time to litigate those and so forth, right? That's still, even if you were able to establish collective ownership, right, control of the land so it can't be alienated and sold off in small parcels, right? If it's owned collectively, then it's communal land, and then the community either doesn't have the right to sell it, including those that resettlement town in Lima for the Shipibo is supposed to be those plans of those houses and so forth, right? There were going to be multifamily dwellings in that along the River Rimac Valley. That was going to be controlled communally, right? So people could live there, but they could not, and they could leave if they wanted, but they couldn't sell that land. They could rent it out to somebody else, those apartments or those houses and so forth, right? That was going to be a communal grant, right, for the land administration of that. So in Peru, it's hard because, in a sense, there is a legal structure, but it's a matter of making sure that those laws are actually enforced, right, and that the communities have a government, which is, and that could be a regional government, that could be a municipal government, and that could be the central government as well. You have multiple levels of government. Some of them may be on your side, others may not, right? And that's one of the challenges, is to actually have those beautifully crafted and thoughtful laws implemented in policies and enforced, right? Often, they say for Latin America, they have the most beautiful constitutions and the most well thought out laws, and the best legal minds in the countries have been involved in crafting them. The problem is the political reality, right, of actually implementing them and following them and allowing people to have the citizenship that Yibing was talking about is actually not a full citizenship, right? Everybody living in the country does not have equal access to make a decision to the political system, to even the media, to get their word out and so forth. So all of those are obstacles. In terms of reclamation of some of the mining areas, we did see places where there's attempts to take slag piles, for instance, right, which are what's left over from the digging of mineral deposits, the processing of it, right, often have lots of toxic metals that can be leached out into water systems. There's some attempts to get those covered with plastic tarps to create, ditches around them that would angle them away from going directly into rivers and bodies of water and so forth. The plant trees or grass on certain areas that have been, slag piles that have been there for a long time to try to keep it from being blown away as dust and becoming airborne particles. But it feels very much like too little, too late, in many cases.
And I got the sense, because we talked to the Minister of the Environment, I got the sense that they really do think the canon is helping, that's their way they're helping these communities. So, we did see the example in Tintaya, I think because somebody got killed, that they made a special, they gave more money, but they had to have a tragedy for that to happen.
One thing that I just wanted to briefly mention is pre-colonial Peru was an agricultural economy. It was an agricultural society, despite the fact that the availability of arable land was small and water scarcity, but communities were dedicated to the exploitation of land, to the genetic manipulation of various crops, including potato, corn, etc. As you know, potato was a poisoning root, and it's through the genetic enhancement that those populations did over the course of hundreds of years that it became an eatable staple. So if you think about peasant communities, they think of mining as a lateral activity, an activity that, yes, the Incas did exploit. They knew how to work with metals and with gold and with silver, but those were used as ornaments, but not the way that mining is exploiting the resources at a global scale, so massively, right? So that was an afterthought that I had from your question.
Okay, we have time for one more question way back in the back.
Yeah, I'm curious as to what happens to the monies, the canning monies that are returned. Is that a strong signal to the Department of Forestry and Environment that these monies aren't being spent, even though they point weight about how they may be disintended or focusing on infrastructure versus schools, that kind of thing? What happens to the money?
Yeah, so the question is about the money, what happens when it's returned? Yeah.
So this is the canon. The canon can be accumulated. So what's not used is resting as a fund, and it's idle, but it's also the property of the community. So eventually it's going to be used. So now civil society in Peru is now trying to find a way to begin to use that resource in a more productive way. They call it the canon dividend or the mining dividend, because it is a plot of money there that could be used for the for the goals that Jenny was indicating, like for health, for education, to improve small projects, etc. But there are legal restrictions, and there is the inability of those communities to use it because they don't have the technical capacity. So one of the ideas that people are beginning to think about is establishing networks or partnerships with universities, with institutions that can help them identify projects that they can develop. And mining companies themselves they have created what's called like a social projection office or an social institutional office, like the one that we visited in Tintaya that had run those projects, right? It was part of that sort of like vision that mining companies have. But so that's like the wrong place where the vision is located. That vision should be located in civil society, and that's what is missing. And unfortunately, there's lots of politics that works as an obstacle for that to develop. So, that would be like the hopeful wish. But I would like my
Well, I just want to, that made me think, we went to Tintaya and the social person who was showing us around all the community projects didn't even know where the community projects were. So that was very striking to us that this is your job and you don't know where it is. So, they can put a lot in a name, but I still think there's got to be some major changes to the way money is allocated. I mean, this is a lot of money that could really, really benefit these communities.
And also, I think, this sort of made me relate to our first featured speaker for the event, the activist Melinda. I think she's from the Canadian Cree First Nation. I think here there's another thing, the Canada money, for me, it's imposed, it's top-down. And it's lacking the true, effective, full inclusive consultation and policy with the community from the community's point of view. And I think I was struck by exactly, some of the pictures show Jenny and, Joe, when we went there, the beautiful town is new, developed. By the way, that mining company, supposedly is the Chinese mining company, right? They built the church, built other things. But they said, well, it's much better than before. Why they don't move? I think here, that's the issue. You lack the understanding. It's also a arrogance. And again, is that I think it's a fundamental flaw of the kind of a developmental logic, top-down, that development logic.
I mean, we tried to get them to tell us how much it cost for this new 5,000 person town. We couldn't get really a straight answer, but it seemed like it was a fraction of the mining profits, a fraction. So, and they were able to build a whole new town. So, we're talking about, there's potential for
millions.
Yeah, in Morococha, they're gearing up, Chinalco, which is the Chinese company that's exploiting it, they're gearing up to open the world's largest copper mine. So it's going to be quite large.
So we're near the end of the time that's allotted for the panel, but I just wanted to thank the panelists one more time. Everyone, thanks. And if I could conclude this session with a warm thank you to the Christian A. Johnson Endeavor Foundation that made it possible for all of us faculty to have these amazing learning experiences. We're all really, really appreciative. Our next order of business is lunch, which is available up in Blaustein Humanities Center, up at the top of the green. It's in Hood Dining Room, so if you go in the front doors, down the stairs, and then left, there'll be a buffet lunch up there. And we will reconvene here at 1:30 for the next session. Thanks.
So they could do that. Yeah.